Oh, yay, recording. I'm going to put this audio recording of some of the lectures, not all of them, but some of them on my personal podcast, unless they suck, in which case I won't be putting them up. If I say anything embarrassing, you'll never hear from me again. So to hear the audio recording, I'll put links on the class website. Otherwise, they're on my personal website at dionandon.com. Any questions from last time? I was so clear. I was so perfectly verbose and eloquent. I conveyed perfect amounts. Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. Or yes, the textbook is fantastic. That must be the case. And we can all access the website now, right? No problems there? Excellent. Please take the questionnaire, the survey that's linked there. Again, it's not mandatory. It's nice. It'll pay off at the end of the semester, I promise. So I'll put the link to it once again before we start. All right, so today we're going to talk about the history, a little bit of the history of global health. Last time we talked about the historical origins of health disparity. Now we'll talk about the history of this thing that we call international/global health, at least the recent history. There was a time when this image, Michael Jackson's history, was a pop culture revelation, but now I realize he's been dead for longer than you've been alive, so this is not relevant anymore. And I feel old. Thank you. That's fantastic. So there's an article on the website called An Introduction to Global Health and Global Health Ethics, and a brief history of global health. And technically the content of the article is testable in the midterm, so I encourage you to read it, and it'll cover some of what we talk about today, but not all of it. I want to start with this graph. This shows us the number of countries reporting smallpox cases from 1950 to about more or less today, so the last 40 years or so. Obviously, we're on a decline dramatically up until the point at which we decided to start eradicating smallpox, and the numbers came down tremendously. I put this up there to point out that in the last recent bit of history, in living memory, we've seen some dramatic changes happening, positive changes. So I want to contextualize today's lecture time-wise over the last 100 years, pretty much since World War II. And as a personal plug, a reminder that I'll be giving a talk at the Action Global Health Network Conference. That's the University of Ottawa Medical School Conference that Sheridan is one of the organizers for. And the topic will be something like this. It will be on whether or not things are in fact getting better or worse based upon the population health indicators that we have available. Here's another way of thinking about, are things getting better? This shows changes from 1990 to 2011, so more or less the last 20 years or so. And we've seen that the percentage of people who are low income is in fact come down from 60% of the world to about 12% of the world. So according to this one measurement, things have changed dramatically. Over the past 100, 200,000 years, this number is probably significantly higher. So in the past 100 years, in the past 2, 3, 4 generations, we've seen some tremendous changes, one could argue positive changes, in the world in terms of measurements of health status, wealth status, and international development. Here's another way of looking at it. This is the gap between China and Sweden. If Sweden is a representation of all things good and shiny, and China is a representation of a struggling country that's coming into its own, from 1751 to 2008, measured in under 5 mortality, so the percentage of children who die before their 5th birthday. We see that the number in Sweden came down dramatically. In China, they didn't come down until this century, and they came down rapidly. In fact, the gap is quite small now. So the modernization of China or these other emerging economies is happening quickly in the past century. More ways of looking at it. Under 5 mortality for the world as a whole. So this is the countries that had it really bad, and these are the countries that had it really good, and we see they're converging now. So in fact, we think before 2040 that both groups of countries will look somewhat similar in terms of this particular indicator. We're going to talk in the future about why this indicator is important. And we're going to look at the other kinds of indicators that we care about, like maternal mortality rate, under 1 mortality rate, things like that. In general, we like these indicators because they are representations of a population's ability to take care of its most vulnerable members. If you can't take care of your most vulnerable members, i.e. children, something's seriously wrong. So the takeaway from this is, in the last 20 years, positive things have been happening. More good stuff. Here's this probability of a child dying by age 5, and we see that in sub-Saharan Africa, it's coming down steadily. In Rwanda in particular, it peaked around 95. Bad things are happening in Rwanda in the early 90s, and then it's coming down rapidly as well. So even in these problematic areas, we're seeing positive change. Okay, I showed you those graphs to give a taste of the talk I'll be giving at the conference at the end of the month, but also to give a sense that in the past couple of generations, interesting things have been happening around the world. And this is due in large part to a revolution in the way we approach international development and global health. Here's a quote from a guy named David Brown in the Washington Post. The important part here is that there's a surging demand for global health and public health and epidemiology, all these key topics, and in fact, we're taking together in fourth year. In fact, all of you are in my epi class, I think. If not, then most of you are, and global health in general. These are hot topic subject areas because the world is waking up to these being sexy topics and relevant topics and skills and talents that we want to invest more in the global skill set. Paul Farmer, who we'll talk about in the future when we talk about ethics, because Paul Farmer is a hero of global health ethics. In fact, he's coming to Ottawa, I think, at the end of the month, early October, late October, for a conference. So if you can make his talks, I recommend it. And he says that global health issues has something to do with problem choice. And problem choice is this thing about choosing your betterment at the expense of other people suffering, or sometimes choosing to address a problematic condition for your own wherewithal and, as a side effect, helping others. It's a complicated kind of thing. But the important part of this quote is that social and political forces with roots in the 19th century are what drive what we perceive today as health and wealth disparities. In essence, what I talked about on Tuesday. So the origins of the struggles we see today are in large part due to the colonial actions of the past couple hundred years. Okay, another quote. This is from Unite for Sight. Unite for Sight is an organization at Yale that offers probably the most well-attended and famous global health conferences. Since I'm recording this and putting this on public consumption, I'm not going to actually comment on them because I got some criticisms. Ordinarily, if I turn this off, I'll tell you some stuff, but I won't do that now. I'll just say that they have a free webinar coming up, and I put a link to it on the website. If you want to take it, it's on career building, I think, in global health. They have a lot of free stuff. But they say, although most global health workers are not historians, all should recognize the importance of historical factors in contemporary health problems, which is what we're going to do today. Okay, so we touched upon the colonial history on Tuesday. Let's go a little further right now. So colonialism's negative impact on public health is threefold according to Unite for Sight. First, through the introduction of non-native diseases. So we saw that when the Spaniards arrived in the New World, bringing smallpox and measles and other good stuff. Second, to the facilitation of the rapid spread of disease. That was done through infrastructural changes, causing people to live in gridded cities rather than contoured abodes, changing the way the agriculture is used. People are leaving again. I don't know why they're leaving. It's interesting, isn't it? I don't know why people leave in the first 5 minutes. It's very mysterious. It's like, you know what lecture you're in. There's not a mystery. You know, you have access to the slides. None of this is surprise. Anyway. And third, by the extraction of wealth, meaning that if you're sucking out the resources from a country you've colonized, you are reducing their ability to address the health problems they currently have. Okay, so they will say that these three factors prevent the native population from growing out of the cycle of poverty and disease, something that the European population was able to do because they weren't affected by these external colonial forces. Here's an example. The Panama Canal, you know what that is, right? The canal that links the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to Panama. It was built for trade. No other reason. It's not built to equalize ocean temperatures. It's not built for ecological reasons. It's not built for the betterment of local population. It's built for global trade, to shorten the path of ships around the South American Horn. Okay? The French failed to build it because of malaria and yellow fever. They tried, but their workers kept on dying. So the swamps were dredged to curb malaria. This was a positive impact on the local healthcare population, but it wasn't done to help people. It was done to help trade. Just happened to be this side effect of having this positive impact. Then the case of Haiti. So Haiti had 400,000 natives before 1492. They had no natives by the 17th century. So all these people were killed off from a combination of abuse, measles, smallpox, and so forth. But then what was left over became a fairly lucrative slave port as a result of, again, colonial forces overlaying this new kind of global trade, this evil global trade of slavery. So the takeaway here is if you didn't know this element of it, you would look at Haiti in the early 1900s and think, oh, this is actually a relatively wealthy place, and the effects of colonialism were positive. But in fact, it came at an incredible price. So here, even though the Panama Canal ended up having a positive effect on Panama in the sense of dredging the swamps, building it cost hundreds of thousands of deaths, and there's no reason for those deaths. Maybe I'm making sense. I'm having a rough day today, so maybe I'm talking around in circles, but I think you get the idea of what I'm trying to say. So, in other words, when we have Western, Northern, wealthy interventions in these nations, there's usually a West-first attitude. So the advances made in vaccinations and so forth weren't done because we want to help people. It's done because we want investments in these areas for commercial interest or for military interest. Okay? So even though the international spread of disease was curbed, it was the extraction of wealth that was the major motivation. This argument goes, and I think this argument is correct. There's not a whole lot of pushback against this argument. The dramatic changes made in the early 20th century around the world had nothing to do with the desire to help people, had everything to do with the desire to maintain a certain military presence and a large-scale commercial enterprise. The lesson, the legacy of colonialism is that historically investments in global health were done for commercial reasons. Today, we think that's not the case, right? We think that we do all these wonderful things out of the goodness of our hearts. Gates Foundation is building a malaria vaccine. Hey, we're spending all this money on a dam system somewhere or other. I will suggest to you that's not the case. I will suggest to you that, in fact, most of what we do is still done for the purposes of preserving our commercial interests. And we do so nakedly at times. So I'm fond of telling stories of my project. So if you go to any number of countries where the Canadian government is funding international development projects. For example, I was doing a project in Guyana. And in Guyana, we had a very large HIV project. And you show up, CETA, which is the Canadian International Development Agency, gives you space. Oh, thank you. They applause for my lecture. A little premature, but I appreciate it. It's nice. They give you space in their local office. The office is called the PSU, the Program Support Unit. And you show up, and there's a fax machine, there's a receptionist, there's meeting rooms. Great, we can start working right away. The office is shared by other interests. Those other interests include mining companies, marketing companies, finance companies, all Canadians that are coming on your back. So even though you are the vanguard, the public face of the Canadian investments in improving the wherewithal of these populations, you're actually opening the door for these commercial interests to come with you. So they always go hand in hand. And maybe they should go hand in hand. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the nature of aid and ethics of global health, but there's an argument to be made that if we're going to spend millions of dollars in other countries, maybe we should get something out of it. The microphone just died. Okay. Is that better? There you go. Okay. So I'll park that idea in the back of your head right now. So let's cast our minds back in time to the end of World War II. Dun, 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 dun. This is always a scary topic when I talk to undergrad students because I always wonder, how bad has our education system become? What do you know about World War II? I have a professor friend in Toronto, and she wants to ask her students, just like a couple of years ago, who did the Allies fight in World War II? And nobody knew. In fact, the most common answer was the Muslims. The Nazis, people, the Nazis, polar opposite, okay? So we have the Allies fighting Nazis and the Axis powers, and at the end of World War II, the world really was different. Empires had fallen, particularly the British Empire had fractured. We have these new independent nations popping out from under the thumb of the British Empire. The process of end of colonialism had begun. A mindset had emerged because World War II was so horrific that a lot of people were thinking altruistically even about using this newfound wealth and power and technology and ability and cohesiveness to maybe address some of the ills of the world. So they looked at things like maybe it's time to rethink the international finance system. We'll have a lecture in the future about different kinds of institutions. We'll talk about something called the Bretton Woods institutions. Have you heard of that? Have you heard of the Bretton Woods institutions? Bretton Woods is a town in New England where a meeting of the leaders of the Allied powers took place where they decided to remake the world's financial system. And out of that came some Bretton Woods institutions, among them the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. We'll talk more about that in the future. But that's a direct result of the victors of World War II thinking, we don't ever want to go through this again. It was so horrific. What can we do to prevent discontentment around the world? What can we do to provide institutions and infrastructure for conflict abatement and diffusing? And what can we do with all this newfound power to address some of the world's largest, most entrenched ills? Because World War II was won, one could argue, via technology. One could argue it wasn't, but there's an argument that, hey, the atomic bomb was made, all this new technology, all this money spent on tanks and stuff. So with new technology and wealth, because now they're crazy wealthy because they've taken over the German Empire, all this new technology, maybe we can use this technology and wealth to attack all these ancient ills like malaria or starvation or famine and things like that. Okay, so the rapid expansion of the world economy happened just after World War II, right, as new wealth was being produced, particularly in the West. And during this period, industrialized economies grew at almost 5%, and 5% growth is astounding. Today, China grows about 10%, which is unheard of. We grow at maybe 1 to 3%. So 5% growth is pretty healthy. And so we have new prosperity to citizens of established industrial powers, and now we have power and modernization. So there was this cholera epidemic in 1947 that killed a lot of people, 20,000 people. So we thought, well, maybe we can organize now. Maybe here's our chance to use wealth and power, technology, organization, political will, for the first time, which is being organized internationally, to combat cholera. And that's kind of where ideas of the United Nations, WHO, arose. A couple years later, NATO was founded. What's NATO? Who knows what NATO is? Whisper, whisper, whisper. I ask this every year, students, and no one ever gives me an answer, even military families. Yes, madam. Right. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this is essentially the collection of Western powers. NATO was founded to combat what? Who is the opposition to NATO? It's not the Muslims, the Nazis. Yeah. Soviet Union, in actuality, but in legality, the Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact was the equivalent collection of allied states on the other side, right? So East Germany, Soviet Union, and so forth. Okay, so that's not really relevant as much as it is interesting that people don't know that anymore. But the Cold War was fought between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And the Cold War ended in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was disassembled. So at the founding of NATO, Harry Truman, the President of the United States, gave a very long speech. And he repeated this speech in other contexts as well. But he mentioned an interesting thing, again, at the founding of a military organization. He said, more than half the people of the world are living in conditions approaching misery. Their food is inadequate. They are victims of disease. Their economic life is primitive and stagnant. Their poverty is a handicap that threatens both them and more prosperous areas. For the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and skill to relieve the suffering of these people. This is interesting. So think about this for a second. This is a U.S. president at the founding of the world's greatest military alliance talking about poverty and disease. So suddenly we're contextualizing the suffering of populations in a military context. Right? It's not surprising, given that they just came out of a situation where military strength allowed them to combat all the world's ills, maybe continue to help us combat the world's ills. And interestingly, he says we have knowledge and skill to relieve the suffering of these people. What knowledge and skills? We got planes and bombs and technology and money. We're going to use all this stuff to literally drop bombs on diseases. Literally. I'll show you what I mean by that. Oh, look, they have the founding of the WHO. So the World Health Organization came out of this mindset again of putting together the will and the resources of the world towards combating the world's ills. Right. So malaria became one of the early targets. Malaria, one could argue, is probably the greatest disease in the history of the world. In fact, there's a question that people always ask at trivia nights: what's the most dangerous animal in the world? And the answer is mosquito, because you all know that, right? It's shocking to a lot of people. Yeah, because mosquito is probably responsible for more human deaths than any other animal. So we launched the Global Malaria Eradication Program in the 50s, again, fresh off of World War II and the founding of the WHO and NATO and things like that. Okay, and the eradication program was based on two tools: the drug chloroquine and DDT. So chloroquine is a prophylaxis that prevents us from getting malaria, or at least it did at one point. And DDT is a pesticide that we can spray en masse and to kill off mosquitoes. So what happened in the 50s and 60s was we were dropping, literally from military aircraft, bombs of DDT onto villages around the world to kill mosquitoes. What do you think happens in that scenario? Yep. It didn't kill humans, made them sick. It may have killed some, yeah. Birth defects, absolutely. A lot of bad stuff. And also, there wasn't a lot of buy-in here. So, in fact, where I'm from, our village was also bombed by DDT and stuff, and it's a known thing, not to be around the DDT comes around, because hey, that's not good for your kids and all that stuff. Also, using chloroquine was not a salve, it was not a cure-all, because what? What happens for any disease, any drug used to prevent the spread of resistance? Exactly. So resistance popped up. So suddenly this very optimistic, simplistic way of thinking that we could literally drop chemical bombs to destroy our enemy was shown to be a falsehood. Now think about that visual for a second. We have these modern tools of war up on high, vertically dropping mass technology onto people with no buy-in to this process. I think what was going on here, right? And it was meant in the best possible way. It was meant to relieve them of long-term suffering, understanding there would be some short-term suffering as well. Okay, so we have drug resistance in humans. We have mosquito resistance, meaning mosquitoes were resistant to the DDT and to other things. We have massive population movements, as people are trying to get away from the places that are full of DDT, and lack of community buy-in. So suddenly there's distrust. Okay? So now we start to see the seeds of this growing distrust of poor populations of this new, wealthy, industrialized West. By the way, the DDT strategy is back in vogue now. We're looking at it again, but in less severe and destructive ways. These are fine tools. The tools themselves are not evil. It's how you apply them that can be evil. Right? So as a result of this eradication program, resulting in drug resistance and population suffering, it evolved to a control program. We don't talk about eradicating malaria anymore. Well, not really. We sort of do now with Gates Foundation talking about a vaccine, but for the longest time we didn't. We talked about controlling malaria. Right? So suddenly the World War II ethos, the mindset of we have technology and power, we can destroy our enemy, was like, maybe we have to coexist with our enemy. Thank you so much. Very kind. Okay. What we see with the dropping of DDT bombs to kill mosquitoes is something called a vertical program. Right? That's why I start with this example, because you can visualize the vertical dropping of bombs. Vertical programs are programs that target downward into specific things. They don't have a whole lot of buy-in from the way up. They don't have a whole lot of partnerships with programs on the side. They are targeted downward. They're focused on a specific demographic, a disease, or a health issue, in this case, mosquitoes, malaria. They have a measurable specific outcome, like, hey, no mosquitoes. That's our goal here. They have a very simple reporting structure. Who are we reporting to? We're reporting to the country that I'm bombing with DDT, and reporting to the people who own the planes. That's who cares about this. and it's usually financed, not always, but by external donors. So in the case of malaria, it's financed by these powerful countries that own the planes and the DDT. And we often use vertical programs in really poor areas, epidemic areas, places that are really suffering. Now, it's easy to bash vertical programs, and I will, because this is a simplistic way of thinking about international health. Most people haven't thought about what we do in global health. Will think about, hey, Ebola, hey, AIDS. We got to spend a lot of money and train some people in spacesuits and get them over there in highly protected spacesuits and I'll do all this expensive stuff. That's a vertical program, expensive and limited. That's not the way things usually work, right? So vertical programs have three components: intervention strategy. It could be dropping DDT from a plane. It could be building a specific set of labs to test for HIV. It could be training a particular cadre of doctors that are going to do a certain thing. A monitoring and evaluation component. We're going to keep track of what we're doing and whether it's working, and we're going to deliver the intervention. It could be rolling out a vaccine. It could be quarantining patients, whatever it might be. Okay, so these are definitions of what these things are. So the intervention strategy is how we're going to attach the program, monitoring evaluation, how we're going to measure it, and the intervention delivery is what we're going to do. Now, hopefully, the best vertical programs can allow us to integrate into a horizontal program. What is that? We'll talk about that next. A horizontal program isn't about dropping a bomb on a problem and destroying it. It's about integrating your system, your interventions, your strategy with things that already exist usually. Usually there's buy-in from a variety of institutions, organizations, and so forth. It relies upon the basic primary healthcare system of the nation that we're dealing with. Think about the malaria example. I don't need to work with local hospitals or the Ministry of Health or the family doctor or the nursing component if I'm just going to drop DDT to kill malaria. That's a simple vertical program. I'm going to drop my stuff and leave. With a horizontal program, suddenly I need to, I got to coordinate with these doctors over there so they know about the program I'm going to deliver because they're going to see more patients. I need to coordinate with the nursing school to know that I got to train these nurses to understand the side effects of all this stuff. So I need buy-in from more organizations. With a horizontal program, there's usually a single reporting system, meaning only the local government needs to be told what's going on, and it's usually financed by the local healthcare system. So horizontal health programs are less sexy, they're more common, they tend to last longer, but they're not great for sudden emergencies. We had, horizontal programs that did not address the Ebola problem, the Ebola outbreak a couple years ago in sub-Saharan Africa. That required a strong vertical response. Okay, examples of vertical programs. HIV/AIDS in Africa. Have you heard of PEPFAR? Anybody know what PEPFAR is? We'll talk more about PEPFAR in future lecture. PEPFAR stands for the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Research, I think. And it was founded by George W. Bush. And this may stagger you, this may astound you, but there are parts of the world, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, where George W. Bush will go down as a hero. In fact, one could argue that he and possibly Oprah did more for AIDS in Africa than anybody else. And part of it has to do with PEPFAR. So he spent a lot of his personal charisma and power was put behind making sure that PEPFAR was well-funded. PEPFAR has its own issues. We'll talk more about PEPFAR in the future. The PEPFAR was very vertical. It's like we're showing up to these countries that struggle with HIV/AIDS. We're going to spend a lot of money. We're going to do it our way. We don't really need local hospitals to buy into it. We're going to build our own hospitals, our own labs, train our own people. We're going to do it the American way, which is a very good way, and we're going to make incredible positive change in these countries. And they did. It's very expensive, but they did it. So HIV/AIDS, I will argue, is a complex problem requiring a high level of technology and technique. So we need, rapid testing swabs. We need up-to-date labs to be able to diagnose certain things. We need new drugs that require a particular nutritional profile and training to apply for it. So a vertical, high-technology, expensive approach was what was required. Right? So as a result, we have HIV treatment centers, we have new laboratories, and training of a new cadre of HIV workers resulting from this very strong vertical program. A horizontal program is something like the Health Centers of Peru, which is nice, inexpensive, and touchy-feely. So Peru reorganized its healthcare system to integrate all this primary care activities organized by the life cycle, which is, as you know, a big theme in this program. We talk about life cycle endlessly. I don't know why. I don't know. Right? So we had separate rooms for children, men, and women, and as you grow up in the system, you move from one center to the next one. And so this continuity of care, everyone knows what your issues are, and we can bring to bear wraparound services of all kinds of things. And it's funded by the Ministry of Health with collaboration from local communities. So it's the ideal of horizontal systems. There's community buy-in, there is multiple investment, and there is maximum uses of the existing resources. So as I mentioned, the vertical programs can sometimes be integrated into a horizontal system. How? It's not that easy. Okay? In fact, that's one of the challenges in trying to sort of manage the delivery of these kinds of programs around the world. These programs are sexy. Donors love to give money to vertical programs. It's easy to raise money for them, but you can't sustain them long term because they're expensive. Why is it easy to get donors for it? Well, think about it. If you're like having a fundraising event, we're going to stamp out malaria. Great, I'll give you money. Oh, we're going to develop a multi-system process for addressing long-term primary health care with a life system approach in Peru. Nobody cares. So one is more easily a market than the other. So we like to talk about this, but it's difficult to then move it into the horizontal system, except that maybe the training that we do here can then be bled into the larger training system. Maybe the indicators that we develop for measuring outcome can then be applied to the larger healthcare system. Maybe the horizontal system can now adopt or incorporate the infrastructure left behind by a vertical system. It's one of the struggles. In fact, I've met PhD students whose entire careers now we built on transforming vertical programs into horizontal programs. Right. So malaria eradication was what? It was a vertical program. Malaria control is a horizontal program. Eradication is easy to think about. Control is difficult to think about. Eradication is difficult to achieve, whereas control is easier to achieve. Eradication, easier to sell. Control, pretty hard to sell. Right. How is malaria control horizontal? It involves a variety of forces. We need city planners to make sure there's no standing water. We need education to make sure people know what to do in the event of getting bitten by a mosquito. We need the pharmaceutical industry on board to make sure we have properly supplied prophylaxis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eradication, planes with bombs. Okay. So that's the difference. As I mentioned, there are some advantages and disadvantages. Right? It's easy to bash the vertical programs, even though that's all we tend to talk about in mass media. Think about your favorite movies that we don't know what they're talking about. Like I think one of the Batman movies, I think, featured a scene where Bruce Wayne is being celebrated for donating money to some international health crisis. It's always going to be a vertical program that they're showing because that's easy to understand and it's sexy and donors love to show off about it. So vertical programs have targeted resources to specific priority health issues, like what? Ebola, HIV, big name stuff. Define goals and objectives, like what? Eradication, that's a big one. Often very successful in a limited time frame. Smallpox eradication, one could argue, was a vertical program. We're going to destroy smallpox, and we did it. Okay, malaria, limited success. Right? We'll talk more about these in the future too. And we tend to get good return on investment for donors, meaning I've given you $1 million. What can you show me for that $1 million? Well, we bought all these vaccines, we give them this many people, and we have these great letters from kids saying they appreciate you. Great return on investment. Disadvantages. Sometimes we weaken the local healthcare system. So we'll talk more about this in the ethics class, but very often when you arrive with highly trained, high-technology Western physicians and healthcare workers, or train your own cadre to do so, the existing healthcare community is now reduced in comparison in terms of power and status and prestige. right? In one of our projects in the interior of Guyana, we would take, rich Toronto doctors deep in the interior, set up a MASH unit, and villagers would come from around the community to come see us. And they had their own healthcare provider, a nurse usually, who would hang out with us and stuff. But then people got used to the idea of waiting for the rich Western doctors to come, and they wouldn't share their problems with the local nurse until we came back. And they would hang on to their issues for years until we came back, and that's not a very effective way of doing things. So our solution was to make sure the nurse came with us, was on TV with us, was on stage with us at all times, so that she was perceived as being equal status with us. Right? So status building is important. Often there's competition for healthcare staff. So if your PEPFAR was problematic in this way, they show up, they build a brand new hospital, a brand new laboratory center, they pay better, and so local workers, the best, will want to work for the PEPFAR program. They don't want to work for the local hospital. As a result, all the best people are going to this shiny new place, and all the existing places are now underserviced. Right? I won't go through all these things, just a few examples here. Lack of sustainability is a big one. So it requires a lot of money. Broker programs require a lot of money, and this money is often dependent upon political cycles. So when Obama came into power, for example, there was a lot of concern that he would not maintain the PEPFAR commitments. He did. He changed it up. I'm not sure what Trump is doing. So if you're so reliant upon the political will of whatever government's in power, then that can be a problem. So horizontal programs have great advantages. I think some of them are obvious. It's just really sustainable because you've already got the things in place. Institutions, staff, all that's in place. It's simply an organizational change that you're making. You have a greater possibility of family-centered care over the entirety of the life cycle, so there's continuity of care throughout your life. We have management of lots of determinants of health. You can manage nutrition, vaccination, education, all that stuff in one place. This is a big one for me, centralized medical records, so we don't lose track of people going through a system. We'll talk later on about health information systems. That's a big problem in many countries. In fact, Canada does not have a great health information system. It's possible for you to move to Saskatchewan or someplace and we lose track of what you've done entirely. So if there's no continuity of information, then there's duplication of services and possibilities of outbreaks and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But horizontal programs are better for that. And horizontal programs are more financially efficient. They have bigger bang for invested buck. However, healthcare systems are pretty weak in a lot of countries. So how do you organize existing resources if the resources that exist are kind of crappy? Right? So maybe you got to spend vertical money early on to start them working. Health workers are poorly trained to do more than one thing. Here in Canada, we have nurses that are great with health education, nutrition, and medicine. But in other countries, you're good at one thing. You're good at treating infection. That's it. Talking to families, that's not my job. Right? So suddenly we need to think more broadly about the roles and training of healthcare workers. Oftentimes they haven't got sufficient supply of stuff, and that weakens the entire system. And, of course, these workers can be overwhelmed as well with having to do all this stuff. I won't go through all these points. You get the idea. This table is in the textbook, I believe, and it summarizes the difference between vertical and horizontal programs. So in general, vertical are disease control programs, and horizontal programs are people-centered primary care. Primary care, by the way, is a term that's I'm going to use a lot, and a term that's used a lot in this field, and no one ever bothers to define it. I'll attempt to do so for you. Primary care has to do with first contact with the healthcare system being at a very basic level, as opposed to, hey, I've got cancer, I need an oncologist. Hey, I've got a breathing issue, I need a respirologist. Instead of going straight to a specialist, we should go to a basic level healthcare worker first that leads us on to higher specialization. It seems obvious to us because we have that here, but that was actually a profound change in thinking when we developed healthcare systems decades ago. So that's what primary care is. So when do we want a vertical program? Is the thing you're thinking about temporary? Then maybe. Ebola outbreak. Hopefully that was temporary. Okay, vertical is good. We're going to drop spaceships and spacesuits and rich guys and get them on the internet fast. Is primary care weak? In some of the countries where Ebola happened, yeah, it was weak. So they needed a quick injection of technique and technology. Is a rapid response needed? Ebola, fine example again. Yes, you need do stuff right now. Needs of the target group who are hard to reach. Okay. Ebola is an example there as well, I guess. Some of the places are quite remote. It's difficult to get them care in a reasonable time frame. And to deliver complicated services with specialized workers. Absolutely. HIV/AIDS is one of those cases. Ebola is another. Anytime there's a particularly vehement infectious disease with a high virulence, again, then yeah, specialized workers are important. So the truth is, though, that most programs are not strictly horizontal. Most of them have some combination of those components. Even the vertical programs I've described, with the exception of malaria eradication, involve to some degree some horizontality. You need to have some buy-in from the local population. You need to use the resources to some extent of local infrastructure. So these are not strict categories. There's going to be some bleed-through. Okay, so in the 70s, back to our narrative of the history of the world. In the 70s, these vertical eradication programs started to being criticized, right? Because that was the ethic of the time after World War II. Eradicate, vertical, technology, money, we have all that stuff. Get out of my way, let me save the world. Okay? So there's a realization that the Western, they call the Western, model of top-down care was not relevant for poor countries. That maybe what works here isn't what's going to work everywhere, and maybe what's needed is some degree of buy-in and long-term programmatic change. That led to primary health care reform, which is still underway today. Right? So the idea of developing human beings, not so much around targeting specific diseases, started to take place. Which brings me to this. This is a poster showing off what's called the Chinese Barefoot Doctors. Anyone going to read Chinese here? Want to read that for me? I've asked this every year and no one's given me a straight answer. Fine, okay. I guess I still don't know. Okay, so the Chinese Barefoot Doctors were a thing that were around for a long time. They just ended, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s. So their revolution was that Mao's China recognized that they could not afford to give really good medical care to all their citizens. In particular, infection control, reproductive care, right? So what they instead was they took a lot of illiterate farmers, barefoot doctors, and trained them in basic medical skills, so that every community would have a handful of these people that you could go to if you needed some general care, like, hey, my foot's broken, I need it set. Hey, I've got this gash, I don't know how to clean this wound to wrap it up. Hey, I'm going to give birth, I don't know what to do. I have a breech birth, how do I turn it around? Some stuff you can train in a few months. Right? And that actually had profound, measurable, positive changes in their population health. And the revelation there was you don't need to invest a lot of money on creating a set of extremely highly skilled workers to have measurable, positive population health change. We've taken this model around the world. So again, where I work in Guyana, we have this thing called MEDEXs. A MEDEX is a medical extender. It's somewhere between a nurse and a doctor. When I mentioned our missions in the interior, we have a nurse. It's not really a nurse, it's a MEDEX. So a MEDEX is a local person that the government has taken into the city to train to be first point of health care contact. Right? And they can do almost anything a doctor can do except for prescribing drugs and surgery and things like that. It doesn't take a whole lot of training. And it works because most of the things people need aren't that complicated. In fact, the most dire need is around reproductive health issues. And well, sure, later on, the stats around maternal mortality rates and infant mortality have a lot to do with just getting very basic early support for your pregnancy, and things that can be prevented quite easily. The biggest thing that causes maternal mortality is bleeding. And bleeding can be controlled quite easily. I'm not a physician. I'm making this up. I could be wrong. That's what I'm told. Okay, so getting back to Chinese Barefoot Doctors, they transformed our way of thinking. That showed us that maybe instead of thinking about technology and extremely highly skilled workers, we should think about expanding primary health care, making the basic access the thing to focus on. And that led to something called the Alma-Ata Declaration. So Alma-Ata is a place in Kazakhstan. People love Kazakhstan. That's great. So in 1978, they held a meeting, and all the wealthy countries of the world attended, and they signed a declaration calling for the urgent and effective action to support the implementation of primary health care throughout the world. What does that mean? Not entirely sure. They did other things too. They reaffirmed this definition of health that we talked about in the first class. They defined health as a human right, which is important. Once you say something is a right, it means that your government is now legally bound to get it for you. That's why people are slow to accept this is a right, that's a right. Once you say it's a right, then I got to give it to you. Right? And there's legal heft behind that. There isn't a whole lot of legal heft behind these declarations, by the way. UN declarations don't mean anything. There's no body to enforce it. But what it does is it's a statement of intent. So they called for, at this declaration, we have to meet the most basic health needs of the entire population, especially in these rural areas, as opposed to just taking big hospitals and spreading them around. We have to involve community healthcare workers, so not just highly skilled clinicians, but traditional healers as well, villagers, all these people, midwives and stuff. We have to have more community participation in design, so less verticality and more upward buy-in. And we have to establish broad interventions outside the healthcare system. What kinds of things exist outside the healthcare system that are relevant to health? Yep. Infrastructure, sure, that's an easy one. What else? Is what we're doing here relevant for health? Sure. Education is a big one. Finance is a big one. So all these things now play into defining health. So they also call for other things like universal coverage, we have that in Canada, people-centered care, which is, again, the primary healthcare model, leadership issues, and thinking about health in all policies. So if we're going to build a highway down the middle of this farm, how does that affect health? Right? If we're going to change our energy policy to focus on coal rather than nuclear, how does that affect health? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So at the same time, we're deep into the decolonization phase of the world. Okay, so primary health care was favored by the new political gestalt that was characterized as the emergence of these freshly decolonized African nations. So they're anti-imperialist, they're anti-European, they're anti-verticality, they're very pro on inclusion. So keep in mind that as these transformations are taking place, there's also a political issue here. So how much of this has to do with identity politics, how much of it has to do with anti-colonialism, how much of it has to do with actual evidence is unclear. But this is the history that we're dealing with. Here's a quote. A rising tide lifts all boats. Heard that quote before? What does it mean? I'll give you a hint. They think it was first said by JFK when he was talking about a particular project that his opponent said is just pork barreling. Pork barreling is when politicians do stuff to support their supporters, to reward their supporters. And he says, no, it's not true. A rising tide lifts all boats. What does that mean? Yeah. That's close. What it means is if we make a population wealthy, then everyone rides for free. Right? So, hey, he's accused of helping this company becoming wealthy. So, well, this company gets wealthy, everybody gets wealthy, right? All the boats will be raised. And this is the mantra of the era of neoliberalism and neoliberal strategies for development. Okay? It's a market economic belief that if you increase development, economic development, you're going to make the whole world wealthier. Is it true? I don't know. There's a lot of pushback against this, but I show this because it defines a way of thinking that was in vogue in the 80s and 90s and is still somewhat in vogue today, though there's some pushback as well. So neoliberalism is the belief that investments in market solutions is the best way to improve wealth and therefore health and therefore power. So market solutions means capitalism, trade, et cetera, as opposed to strengthening government or investing in public situations. In other words, the free market is a better tool for growth than government intervention. This is relevant because when we talk about the institutions that affect development and health, a lot of them aren't so much involved in spending money on hospitals or AIDS or eradication or whatever it might be. They're involved in how can we produce wealth, with the assumption if I produce wealth, everything else will take care of itself. Is that right or wrong? I don't know. Right? By The innate socialist in me says, hell no. On the other hand, we've seen it happen, right? The miracle of India. India was about to collapse economically in the early 90s. In fact, the government was so dysfunctional at one point that the Supreme Court was issuing direct edicts to various government agencies to, hey, deliver the mail, hey, pay the employees, because the government is dysfunctional. And it got so bad that they had to go to the IMF to bail them out. And when the IMF, we'll talk about this in the future, was involved, that they demanded certain neoliberal adjustments that turned India into the great capitalist center it is today, and today it is an economic giant. Okay? The structural adjustments that I talked about include things like devaluing your currency, choosing privatization over public ownership, deregulation, and so forth. So when you devalue your currency, and we'll see this many times, different countries. So one of the strategies for the neoliberal mindset for improving development is if I'm a wealthy country trying to make you, a poor country, more competitive, I'll tell you, lower the value of your currency. Why? Because now I can buy your products. Your products cost less in the open market, so you're going to sell more of them. On the other hand, you can't buy my stuff as easily. You can't buy oil as easily. So there's a trade-off here. So devaluing currency is the first step. Privatization is another. So India used to have a really interesting soft drink industry. They had brands like Limca, right, and Thumbs Up Cola. And for the longest time, Pepsi was trying to get into the Indian market. And India got no Western products here. We've got to protect our indigenous colas. And then when they started the deregulation process, one of the requirements was you need to open your doors to having foreign products being sold. And then Coke says, we want in. So India let Coke in, and Pepsi says, hey, we're in line. So screw you, Pepsi, we're Coke. So Coke comes in, and Coke now owns Limca. Have you had a Limca? Have you been to India and had these colas I'm talking about? Okay. Ever read the bottle? It's packaged by Coke. It is. Yeah, right? It wasn't 20 years ago. Right, so the formula has changed, and now it's literally owned by Coca-Cola. So now we have these previously indigenous products that are now owned by multinationals. Is that good or bad? I don't know. It's just a fact. So that's what's happening around the world in the wake of development philosophies. I'm not saying what's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is what has happened, right? And what has happened responds to changing philosophies. We had the top-down vertical technology philosophy of the post-World War II era. Before that, we had the colonial philosophy. Then we had the primary care philosophy of the 70s. Then we entered the neoliberalism phase that's big in the 80s and 90s. What's happening now? I'm not entirely sure. What I'm describing, though, are a series of Copernican shifts. These are paradigm shifts, shifts in how we think about the world, shifts in the philosophies of how we approach development issues and wealth generation issues. No one knows what's right or wrong, but the theories are changing. The ethics also evolve. And I say this because what is in vogue today will not be in vogue 10 years from now. What I tell you today may not be in place 10 years from now. The opinions I have today may change 10 years from now, so don't hold me to any of this. And so don't be so. Some students in the past have asked me, so is this right or wrong? There's no right or wrong here. There's just some theories. We throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Okay. We have a lot of challenges today as the new ethic emerges. One of them is a knowledge-action gap. So we think we know how to do stuff, but we don't know how to implement that stuff into action. The implementation bottleneck, that's the idea that the stuff we want to do, we can't do them fast enough because we're held back by HR issues or geographical issues or policy issues. So we're kind of held back at the moment. Measurement, as an epidemiologist, is a big one for me. We often don't know the burden of things or the effectiveness of things. A lot of international health projects, the time is at 6:30, don't have an evaluation component. We don't know if they work. That may stun you, given that you've all taken that program evaluation class, so you know the importance of program evaluation. But the rest of the world is just waking up to the idea of needing evaluation. So one of my companies, yes, I have some companies, but they're not doing well. So one of my companies is all we do is evaluate international programs. Because they don't know how to do them, we will step in and say, hey, yes, we'll do it for you. Right? So evaluation is a really big part of the current landscape of international health and development, and no one knows how to do it well. As you know, drug resistance is an emerging issue, and we may be entering a new phase of infectious disease tyranny. We don't know yet. And now we have vertical programs within horizontal programs and these hybrid kinds of ways of looking at things. In other words, if you're thinking about a career in global/international health, don't think about the ways it was described 30 years ago on TV shows about, hey, I'm going to become a doctor, then do these trips to these forsaken places and give vaccines out. Yeah, that's still needed to some extent. That's not really what we're talking about at the global level. We're talking about this stuff, programmatic stuff, measurement issues, policy issues. And that's where I'm going to put most of the emphasis on this course. Okay, so when I talk about history of global health, people always ask me for, but what's the narrative? What's the story? Okay, here's a couple of slides that will give you just a sense of the story of global health going back a couple hundred years. It's not exhaustive. It's just a sense of way things happen in what order. So in the 1400s, we had the Black Death, bubonic plague. Plague is still around, by the way. Pops up on the West Coast occasionally, India occasionally. 1796, Jenner injects James Phipps. So James Phipps was a young boy, I think the gardener's son on Jenner's compound, and he injected him with his first variolation from cowpox and found, oh my God, James Phipps is now immune from smallpox. Right? So that was our first functional vaccine against smallpox. 1851, that's when we had our first idea of sanitary regulations. Right? So resulting from Jon Snow's revelations around the origins of cholera. So cleanliness is associated with infection. We've got the Broad Street cholera outbreak. So Jon Snow was the inventor of epidemiology. You know that because you're all in my class. The Red Cross was founded shortly thereafter. The League of Nations was the precursor to the United Nations. It kind of failed at the end of World War I. The first TB vaccine was developed in the 1920s. We have penicillin showing up shortly thereafter, and so forth and so forth. I'm not going to test you on this, by the way. It's just for your own erudition, right? So it wasn't until the late 1920s we start getting the stuff that we associate today with development. We've got the World Bank, which we'll talk about in a couple lectures. What's the Marshall Plan? You know what the Marshall Plan is? The Marshall Plan was the Allies' plan post-World War II to rebuild Europe. It's probably the ultimate in vertical programs. So they showed up and they took out all the rubble from the destroyed cities of Europe and turned them into the economic giants you know today. Many people argue that Germany and France would not be the incredibly wealthy, powerful nations they are today had it not been for the Marshall Plan. And there are downsides to the Marshall Plan as well. Part of it, though, was in competition with the Warsaw Pact, who were developing Eastern Europe. Why is Western Europe so much wealthier than Eastern Europe? Lots of reasons. One of them is the Marshall Plan. Right. So the Declaration of Human Rights occurred in 1948 as a result of Nazi atrocities. So again, all this stuff is directly birthed from World War II. I'll skip ahead to some fun stuff. Right. So 2000, we've got the MDGs. We've also got this thing called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. It's an ongoing effort to develop new vaccines. Now Gates Foundation is trying to develop a malaria vaccine. The Global Fund we'll talk about in the future. The Global Fund was actually founded as a result of a paper written by a University of Ottawa professor, Amir Adaran, who I'm going drinking with tonight. So we'll talk about this class a bit, right? So the Global Fund is really fascinating. So this university has a role to play in some of this. PEPFAR, 2003, and the Paris Declaration of 2005, which we won't spend a lot of time talking about, but I put it up for you to recognize that there's still ongoing issues around agreeing how to measure things. This was a meeting where they sat down and decided, here are the indicators we will use to measure certain kinds of outcomes. People disagree still. 2005, they started sort of formalizing the determinants of health. Stuff you learned in first year is slow to percolate to the highest levels of decision makers. In 2005, rubella was finally eliminated in the USA. In the heart of the wealthy Western hegemon, we finally have eradicated rubella. So progress is being made in dramatic ways, but there's work to be done in new, different kinds of pockets. I will stop there unless there are any questions. Y'all look so bored. All right, fine. We'll see you Tuesday.